Marriage is sold to women as safety. Not just emotional safety, structural safety, safety from poverty, safety from suspicion, safety from being treated like a free-floating problem in a world that loves women best when they're attached to something male and respectable. It's also sold as legitimacy, a status upgrade. Before marriage, you're still figuring it out. After marriage, you're settled. You've been chosen. You're secure in your future. People talk to you differently. They treat you differently. You suddenly get invited into this whole social category called normal, and you're expected to be grateful for it. And look, I get why that pitch works. Precarity is terrifying. Being judged for existing is exhausting. So when a major institution offers you a package deal that includes belonging, social approval, and the suggestion that you will no longer be eaten alive by society's wolves, it can feel rational to take part. But here's the part they don't put on the invitation. Marriage is the only contract that people sign while everyone claps and your aunt cries in the background. And historically, it was never just a romance milestone. It was legal infrastructure, a governance tool, a system for stabilizing property, disciplining sexuality, organizing labor, and keeping men's authority inside the household legible to the state. In other words, the prettiest cage that women often find themselves in comes with a ring. Marriage tells women that if they comply with the script, they'll be rewarded. Rewarded with approval, security, belonging. And crucially, it's framed as voluntary. These days, nobody drags you down the aisle. It's more refined than that. The pressure is ambient, cultural, relentless. It arrives from every direction until it stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like common sense. Of course you want to get married. Of course you want to be chosen. Of course you want stability. Marriage doesn't usually present itself as a loss. It presents itself as an upgrade. Which is why the metaphor matters, because the cage is beautiful. It's decorated, celebrated, blessed. It's introduced with music and flowers and vows spoken in front of witnesses. The bars are polished, the lock is hidden, the structure is framed as shelter, and women step inside it willingly. Not because they're stupid, not because they're naive, but because the world outside has been designed to feel dangerous, because being unprotected carries real risks, because the promise is not imaginary, it's just conditional. And the condition is rarely emphasized at the point of entry. Marriage sells itself as the solution to uncertainty. It promises arrival, safety, the comfort of being chosen by your true love. But the fantasy depends on silence about the exit. The story lingers on the proposal, the dress, the vows, the celebration, and it skips the part where the protection fails, the safety disappears, and the shelter becomes the source of harm. Ask what happens then, and you're treated like you're ruining the vibe by naming what is being hidden. And for many women, that promise is powerful enough to override every quiet doubt. But promises only matter if you can leave when they're broken. Marriage doesn't just change how a woman is perceived, it changes how the law understands who she is. This is the part of the story that sits underneath the romance, the part that rarely makes it into sermons or speeches at weddings. Marriage is not just a social bond, it is a legal reorganization, and for most of Western history, that reorganization is comprehensive and asymmetrical. So here's where we break down this cage and the locks that make it so hard to leave. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is Happily Ever After. Some terms and conditions may apply.
Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
It's just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
If this story were inevitable, if marriage had always worked this way, it would look the same everywhere. It doesn't. Patriarchy is widespread, don't get me wrong, but legal patriarchy is not uniform, and that distinction matters. Different societies built different rules around marriage, property, and women's legal existence, which means that the English common law model that most Americans are working with is not the natural endpoint of history. It's a particular solution to a particular problem: how to stabilize property, lineage, and male authority by making women legally disappear without needing constant force. To understand how that works, we need to step back before we zoom in on the English system. In ancient Rome, marriage did not automatically erase a woman's legal identity. This does not make Roman society feminist, it absolutely was not. But by the time Roman law reached maturity, adult women could be legally emancipated. A married woman did not automatically become part of her husband's family. Marriage had relatively little effect on her property. What she owned remained hers. What she acquired during marriage belonged to her. Her husband was not liable for her debts, and she was not liable for his. There were restrictions, of course. Roman law limited women's ability to act as sureties under a statute from the reign of Claudius, Patriarchy was still doing its thing, but here's the crucial point. Marriage did not require her to legally stop existing. Spanish law, which was heavily influenced by Roman legal traditions, offers a useful bridge between that world and what comes next in the modern world. Under Spanish law, women retained ownership of property they brought into marriage and could recover it in certain divorce situations. If a woman died childless, her property returned to her birth family rather than being absorbed permanently into her husband's line. Children inherited from both parents, and Spanish naming conventions preserved maternal lineage in a way that made women harder to erase on paper. Women kept their maiden surnames, and those names were carried forward, at least for a generation. Was this equality? No. Husbands often managed wives' property, and wives typically needed permission to sell or buy property. That was still patriarchal management. But here's the difference that matters. Married women could enter contracts, conduct transactions, and access courts without needing their husband to speak for them. Their legal existence persisted even under constraint. So we have multiple patriarchal systems on the table. Some constrain women entirely, some manage them, but not all of them require disappearance. Then there's England. England takes the idea of marital unity and turns it into something far more total. Under English common law, marriage didn't just rearrange power, it absorbed the woman's legal identity entirely. This is something called coverture, and it is the core mechanism of the very pretty cage that we are living with in the modern world. Under coverture, a married woman becomes a femme covert, a covered woman. The law treats husband and wife as a single person, and that person is the husband. She cannot own property independently. She cannot sign contracts. She cannot execute a will on her own. She cannot sue or be sued in her own name. Even if she is injured, physically or financially, the law assumes her husband is the proper party to act on this. Marriage doesn't make her half a person. It makes her zero. And crucially, England doesn't present this as cruelty. It sells it as unity, a protection, as love made legal. William Blackstone, whose legal commentaries shaped both English and early American law, describes coverture as benevolent. The wife's legal existence, he says, is suspended during marriage and incorporated into that of her husband under his wing, protection, and cover. That language matters. It frames erasure as a romantic shelter for women. But in practice, this meant one thing. When the law says two people are one, only one of them gets to speak. Property flows through him. Wages flow through him. Legal authority flows through him. And if that marriage becomes unsafe, unhappy, or intolerable, the woman does not approach the law as an independent adult seeking relief. She approaches it as a problem located inside someone else's authority. This is why marriage under English common law is not just a relationship status. It's a legal swallowing, a reclassification, a transfer of personhood that is easy to enter and extraordinarily difficult to leave. And this is the model England exports to its colonies, to early America, and eventually to a culture that treats it as traditional. England didn't invent patriarchy. It did, however, invent the paperwork that made women disappear. And once the law builds a system like that, culture gets to work making it feel like common sense. Mid-century research on young people's role expectations shows how deeply normal adulthood was defined as marriage plus a gendered division of labor. Long before TikTok trad wives ever got a ring light, settled meant married, and responsible meant the wife absorbing the domestic workload as proof that a family was functioning. The cultural pressure isn't new, only the aesthetics are. So what happens when the protection fails? Because if marriage erases you legally, then leaving marriage isn't just an emotional drama, it's a jurisdictional crisis. If marriage erased a woman's legal identity, divorce didn't restore it automatically, if you could even get one. For most of Anglo-American history, divorce was not treated as an exit someone had the right to. It was treated as an exception that you had to earn. And earning it required money, credibility, and the right kind of suffering. Under English common law, marriage was presumed permanent. Church courts could grant separations from bed and board, but these did not dissolve the marriage or allow remarriage. You could live apart, you could not start over. Full divorce required an act of Parliament. That meant something very specific in practice. To leave a marriage, you had to convince the state that your private life merited public intervention. Your marriage became a legislative matter. Your sexual history became evidence. Your character became a political question. Divorce was not adjudicated quietly. It was staged. Parliamentary divorces were ruinously expensive. Legal fees alone put them far beyond the reach of ordinary people. Even among the elite, divorce was rare because the cost wasn't just financial, it was reputational. Every accusation had to be proven publicly. Witnesses testified, details were printed, marital failure became a spectacle. And the standards were not symmetrical. A husband could petition for divorce on the grounds of his wife's adultery alone. A wife had to prove adultery plus an aggravating offense, usually cruelty, desertion, or incest. The law presumed male infidelity was unfortunate but manageable. Female infidelity was a structural threat. This wasn't about morality, it was about lineage. Inheritance depended on controlling women's sexuality. Divorce law was designed to protect that priority, even if it meant trapping women in violent or degrading marriages. Only a handful of women ever successfully obtained parliamentary divorces before the mid-19th century. One of the most famous was Jane Addison, who in 1801 became the first woman granted a full divorce by Parliament with the right to remarry. Her case succeeded only because her husband's adultery was impossible to ignore and because she had elite backing. Fewer than a dozen women would manage the same before the law was reformed. The message was unmistakable. Divorce existed, but not for you. When England exported this system to its colonies, Americans inherited both the law and the logic. Early American divorce did not take place in ordinary courts. In many colonies and early states, divorce petitions went directly to legislatures. If you wanted out of a marriage, you had to petition lawmakers. Your private life became public document. Your neighbors became witnesses. Your reputation became evidence. Once again, divorce was not a right. It was a favor granted to those who could persuade the state that their suffering met the necessary threshold. And once again, gender mattered. Men were more likely to be believed. Women were more likely to be scrutinized. Female petitioners had to demonstrate not only harm, but virtue. They had to show that they were injured despite being obedient wives. Any hint of independence, anger, or sexual agency would work against them. This is why divorce, when it did occur, so often turned into a scandal. Take the case of Sarah Althea Hill in the 1880s. Hill claimed she had secretly married California Senator and railroad magnate William Sharon. When she sued for divorce, Sharon denied the marriage existed at all. What followed was nearly a decade of litigation, countersuits, accusations of forged marriage contracts, and intense public scrutiny. Hill's credibility was shredded in court and in the press. She was portrayed as unstable, manipulative, delusional. The legal question of whether a marriage existed collapsed into a cultural judgment about what kind of woman she was. The law did not simply decide the case, it punished the attempt. Another American example makes the same point through a different lens. In the early 20th century, Leonard Kip Rhinelander sought an annulment from his wife Alice on the grounds that she had concealed her racial background. The case became a national spectacle. Alice Rhinelander's body was examined in court to determine whether her race should have been obvious to her husband. This was divorce law doing racial governance, class enforcement, and gender discipline all at once. Annulment didn't just end a marriage, it reaffirmed who was allowed to belong and on what terms. By the early 20th century, Americans began to exploit the cracks in the system. If your home state made divorce difficult, you left. States like Nevada developed reputations for short residency requirements and accommodating courts. Couples would establish temporary domicile, obtain a divorce, and return home hoping the matter was settled. Sometimes it wasn't. Before the 1940s, states could refuse to recognize divorces granted elsewhere. People who believed they were legally divorced could be prosecuted for bigamy when they remarried back home. Leaving one jurisdiction did not guarantee that you were leaving your marriage. The Supreme Court had to intervene. In Williams v. North Carolina, the court ruled that the states were required to give full faith and credit to divorce guarantees granted in other states, provided proper domicile requirements were met. The decision resolved a jurisdictional nightmare, but it also revealed something deeper. Divorce was not controversial because it undermined love. It was controversial because it undermined control. Every time the law widened access to exit, it had to decide how much authority it was willing to lose. And every time, it tried to claw back some of that authority through cost, stigma, or procedural barriers. Which brings us to the most powerful enforcement mechanism of all. Because marriage didn't just bind women through law, it bound them through their children. And once children entered the equation, leaving became exponentially more dangerous and difficult. If marriage was the contract, the divorce was the permission, and the children were leverage. Because once children entered the picture, leaving a marriage stopped being a question of adult autonomy and became a question of survival. Not just emotional survival, economic, legal, maternal. Under English common law and the American systems built from it, children were not neutral dependents. They were a legal extension of paternal authority. The logic was simple and devastating. The father was responsible for providing economically, therefore the children belonged to him. Not to the marriage, not to the family unit, to him. This made custody one of the most effective enforcement mechanisms keeping women inside marriages. A woman considering separation wasn't just weighing her own safety or dignity, she was weighing the very real possibility of losing her children entirely. And that possibility wasn't theoretical. In 19th century America, courts overwhelmingly favored fathers in custody disputes. Mothers were framed as caregivers, not guardians. Caregiving was considered emotional labor. Authority was considered legal labor. Only one of those counted. So if a woman left her husband, she often left her children behind, or she left knowing she could be cut off from them at any moment entirely at her husband's discretion. Custody wasn't something she possessed. It was something she was occasionally allowed. One of the clearest windows into how this worked comes from an early American legal battle involving the woman Clarissa Wren. Clarissa Wren's husband, Aquila Wren, accused her of adultery and pursued divorce. The accusation itself followed a familiar pattern. Sexual suspicion weaponized to destabilize a woman's credibility. But the legal consequences didn't stop there. Even after Aquila's death, Clarissa had to continue fighting in court to protect her property rights and maintain economic survival. Her case eventually reached the Illinois Supreme Court, and early in his legal career, Abraham Lincoln was involved in arguing aspects of it. What mattered here isn't Lincoln's resume, though. It's what Clarissa's struggle reveals to us. Even when marriage ended through death rather than choice, a woman still had to prove she deserved access to property tied to the marriage. Widowhood restored fragments of legal personhood, but only after scrutiny, only after justification. The law did not assume women were entitled to survive independently. It assumed dependence, and treated independence as suspicious. That assumption shaped custody as much as property. Even when American courts slowly began to acknowledge that young children might benefit from maternal care, this didn't translate into real security for mothers. What emerged was the so-called tender years doctrine, which suggested that small children might be better off with their mothers. But this was not a right, it was a condition. Custody under this logic depended on moral performance. Mothers could lose children for perceived sexual impropriety, remarriage, public independence, or simply being inconvenient. A woman's maternal identity did not protect her from punishment. It sharpened the blade. And then, of course, there was money. Under Coverture, a woman's wages belonged to her husband. If she worked outside the home, her earnings flowed into his control. If she worked inside the home, her labor was treated as duty rather than a contribution. Either way, she did not accumulate independent economic standing. So when a woman left a marriage, she often left without income, without property, and without guaranteed support. Alimony existed, but it was discretionary, temporary, framed not as compensation for labor contributed to the marriage, but as charity granted to deserving women who had suffered correctly. Judges evaluated women not just on harm, but on temperament. Anger worked against her. Independence worked against her. Sexual agency worked against her. And all of this fed back into the custody issue. A woman who challenged her husband risked being labeled immoral. An immoral woman risked losing her children. A woman without children had even fewer claims on support. The system didn't just discourage leaving, it stacked the consequences against it. This is why so many women never formally divorced. They separated quietly, they moved in with relatives, they took on informal jobs. They remained legally married because formal exit was too dangerous, too expensive, too humiliating, and too likely to end in loss. Later, the law would look back at those arrangements and say, see, divorce rates were low back then. Marriage was stable. Yeah, that's not stability. That's a jail cell. And here's the thing that makes the system so effective. The threat didn't need to be carried out very often. Women didn't have to lose custody en masse for custody law to function as leverage. They just needed to know it could happen, that the law would not protect them if it did, that motherhood did not override paternal authority. This is how the governance works when it's functioning smoothly. It doesn't rely on constant punishment. It relies on anticipation, on fear, on the rational calculations that women have to do to survive. By the mid-19th century, reformers began to notice how grotesque this looked in practice. Custody laws shifted incrementally. Married women's property acts carved out limited exceptions. Women slowly gained the ability to own property and wages in their own names. But notice the pattern. Reform arrives only after decades of visible harm. And even then, it arrives narrowly, carefully, with conditions. Women gained partial property rights, but not equal standing. Mothers gained limited custody presumptions, but only if they behaved correctly. Divorce became more accessible, but still stigmatized. The cage didn't disappear, it adapted. Which brings us to the final question the system had to answer. If women could leave in theory, how do you make sure they still don't? Once divorce became possible, even in narrow, conditional ways, the system faced a new problem. You have to discourage people from using it. You can't ban it outright. Bans invite rebellion. They create martyrs. They produce movements. Instead, you make leaving visible, humiliating, expensive, and narratively dangerous. Under the logic of coverture, a wife leaving her husband isn't exercising personal freedom. She's breaching a governing structure. She's refusing a role that stabilizes property, lineage, and male authority. She's not just leaving a man, she's leaving her assigned function, which is why divorce becomes something more than a legal process. It becomes a public warning system. By the mid-19th century, American divorce trials were no longer quiet legal proceedings, if they ever had been. They were morality plays staged for public consumption. Newspapers printed testimony in lurid detail. Sexual conduct, tone of voice, emotional reactions, all of it became evidence in the public arena. Divorce courts didn't just decide who was at fault. They taught the public what kind of women were allowed to leave. And the answer was almost none. A woman seeking divorce had to perform an impossible balance. She needed to be injured enough to justify exit, but not angry enough to seem rebellious. She needed to be virtuous enough to deserve sympathy, but not passive enough to appear weak. She needed to be truthful, but not loud, respectable, but not ambitious. And if she failed any part of that performance, the law didn't just deny relief, it punished her visibility. That punishment is on full display in Forrest v. Forrest in the early 1850s. Catherine Forrest wasn't just any woman. She was famous, an actress, a public figure. When she accused her husband Edwin Forrest of adultery, the case exploded into national sensation. The press devoured it. Testimony was printed verbatim. Audiences followed developments the way they followed serialized fiction. This mattered because it normalized the idea that women's marital suffering was public property and entertainment. Catherine ultimately won her divorce and was awarded alimony, but the story didn't end there. Edwin Forrest refused to pay. What followed was more than a decade of appeals, enforcement battles, and legal obstruction. So even when a woman won, she remained trapped in the system she was trying to escape. Divorce didn't free her. It bound her differently. By the 1860s, divorce scandals in places like New York took on an even darker edge. In the case of Mary Strong, divorce proceedings fused adultery, abortion accusations, and child custody into a single explosive narrative. Mary admitted to an affair with her husband's brother. Her husband sued. She countered with allegations that he had forced her into an abortion and conducted an affair with the abortionist. Then she fled with her child. This is where the system shows its teeth. Mary Strong was not simply portrayed as an unfaithful wife. She was portrayed as dangerous, unstable, unfit. Her reproductive history and maternal identity became weapons against her. The court wasn't just deciding the fate of a marriage. It was deciding whether a woman who stepped outside sexual and marital obedience deserved access to her own child. This is a pattern, not an anomaly. Divorce trials routinely turned women's bodies into evidence. Pregnancy, sexual history, medical care. All of it became admissible. Leaving a marriage didn't just expose the relationship, it exposed the woman's entire moral record. By the late 19th century, women with resources began to exploit the one vulnerability the system couldn't fully control: geography. States with lenient residency requirements, as I mentioned before, became known as divorce mills. Sioux Falls, South Dakota emerged as the most infamous divorce colony. Women relocated temporarily, waited out the residency clock, and filed for divorce. This was exit by logistics, and it terrified lawmakers. Newspapers framed divorce colonies as moral contagions. Clergy warned of social collapse. Legislators panicked that marriage itself was being lost to the grips of Western debauchery. Congress eventually authorized a national investigation into divorce statistics, not because women were suffering, but because women were leaving. The question was never, why are marriages failing? It was, how do we stop them from leaving? By the end of the 19th century, divorce had become not just a personal risk, but a political one. The marriage and divorce of Mary Nevins into the family of presidential candidate James G. Blaine became front-page news. Her pursuit of divorce was framed as a threat to public morality and, by extension, to Blaine's legitimacy as a national leader. Divorce scandals didn't just damage families, they damaged political campaigns. Women's private suffering became public ammunition. Divorce functioned as a reputational landmine, especially for men in power, and women still somehow paid the price for stepping on it. And yet, the system was never airtight. When women had money, the cage creaked. Alva Vanderbilt's 1895 divorce from William K. Vanderbilt shocked elite society. Divorce among the ultra-wealthy was still very taboo, but Alva didn't just leave. She secured a massive settlement and custody arrangements that challenged all of the prevailing norms at the time. Her wealth insulated her from some consequences, but it also exposed the truth. Divorce wasn't impossible, it was just priced out of reach for the average woman. Across all of these cases, one thing remains consistent. Divorce wasn't designed to fail quietly, it was designed to warn loudly. The law didn't just adjudicate marital breakdown, it staged it, broadcast it, moralized it. It turned women who left into lessons. Not cautionary tales about bad marriages, cautionary tales about disobedience. Which is why every expansion of divorce rights has been met with backlash. Fault requirements, custody threats, financial penalties, cultural shame. In the 20th century, this entire system has to adapt again, this time with a change so significant that it reshapes power inside marriage itself. Because when exit becomes thinkable, even hypothetical, control starts to slip. And when control slips, tradition suddenly becomes sacred. By the mid-20th century, the marriage system had a problem it could no longer hide. It wasn't that women were suddenly demanding freedom en masse, it was that the existing divorce regime had become administratively absurd and morally indefensible. Courts were flooded with perjury. Couples who mutually wanted to separate had to invent cruelty, adultery, or abandonment just to satisfy the legal requirements. Judges knew it, lawyers knew it, everyone was lying, and everyone pretended that this was about preserving moral order. In other words, the cage was still standing. The solution that emerged was deceptively simple. No-fault divorce. Instead of forcing one party to be legally blamed, no-fault divorce allowed marriages to end on the grounds that they were no longer workable. No need for moral theater, no reputational trials, no requirement that someone be punished enough to justify exit. In 1969, California became the first U.S. state to adopt no-fault divorce. The bill was signed by Ronald Reagan, which is worth sitting with for a second. I'll pause. Within a decade, nearly every state followed. And here's the crucial thing. No-fault divorce didn't just change divorce. It changed the entire concept of marriage itself. Because when exit becomes realistic, the balance of power inside marriages shifts. Bargaining changes, threats lose force. The knowledge that someone can leave alters how control works, even if they don't take that out. For the first time in Anglo-American legal history, marriage stopped being a one-way trap by default. And the backlash was immediate. Critics claimed that no-fault divorce would destroy families, destabilize society, and unleash moral chaos. Women, in particular, were blamed for abandoning marriages that previous generations had endured. Divorce rates were treated as evidence of decay rather than proof that people could finally leave bad situations without destroying their lives in court. But notice the pattern. The outrage wasn't about divorce existing. Divorce had existed for centuries. The outrage was about who could effectively use it. No-fault divorce removed the requirement that women perform suffering correctly for the public. It removed the need to prove virtue, injury, or obedience. It treated marriage as a voluntary relationship that could end without a moral villain. That was the real threat. Because when marriage is no longer enforced primarily through fear of ruin, it has to rely on consent, and consent is much harder to govern. Which brings us to now. The past few years have seen renewed efforts to roll back or restrict no-fault divorce. These efforts are often framed as pro-family, pro-child, or pro-stability. But if you listen very carefully, the underlying logic hasn't changed. The argument is that divorce should be harder, slower, more conditional, that people, especially women, should have to justify leaving. At the same time, we're seeing policy debates that revive older assumptions about identity and dependency, voting laws that make name changes more burdensome for married women, legal frameworks that presume family stability while narrowing the definition of autonomy, cultural movements that romanticize endurance while ignoring power. None of this is new. It's the same system adapting again. Because the cage does not disappear when it's challenged. It learns, it rebrands, it shifts from explicit prohibition to administrative fiction, from open punishment to moral pressure, from law to culture and back again. But here's the part that's hardest to sit with. The system doesn't require most women to be trapped forever. It only requires enough women to be trapped enough of the time to make leaving feel risky. It relies on uncertainty, on calculation, on the knowledge that exit is technically available but still far too costly. That's how control survives reform. Marriage is not inherently oppressive, but historically it has been designed as a governance structure first and an emotional bond second, and every time women gain leverage inside it, there is a coordinated effort to restore the old balance under a new name. Call it tradition, stability, family values, responsibility. It's all the same cage, it's just gotten a new paint job. Which is why this history matters, not because it tells us marriage is always a trap, but because it shows us exactly when and how it will become one, and because it reminds us that rights don't disappear all at once. They're narrowed, they're delayed, they're made harder to use, until people stop calling them rights at all. Marriage was sold as safety, divorce was framed as failure, and autonomy was treated as a threat. Next time, we're going to talk about the cultural enforcement arm of all of this law. The myths that taught women how to behave before the court ever got involved. The good girl rules, the purity scripts, the moral narratives that made cages feel like a choice. Because law doesn't work alone. Culture makes sure it doesn't have to. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is Bitchy History.
History.
History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?